My mother spent thousands on my sister's problems, but wouldn't spend 100 on mine. I didn't spend anything when her problem finally cost her everything. The text arrived at 9:23 p.m. on a Thursday in November, my mother's contact photo lighting up my phone screen while I sat in my apartment reviewing quarterly financials for the audit firm where I'd worked for 8 years. The message was simple, desperate, typed with the shaky urgency of someone whose world was collapsing. Need $15,000 by tomorrow morning. House going into foreclosure. Bank won't extend. Please call. I read it 3 times, my coffee going cold beside my laptop, and felt absolutely nothing. No surge of panic for her crisis. No instinct to check my savings account balance. Just a vast, cold clarity that this moment had been building for 29 years, and I'd finally stopped caring enough to prevent it. I typed back 4 words that felt like closing a door that had been slamming on my fingers my entire life. I can't help you. Then I turned off my phone, returned to my spreadsheets, and felt lighter than I had in years. The weight I'd been carrying, the weight of hoping my mother would finally see me as worth investing in, simply evaporated. She'd taught me through 3 decades of systematic neglect that some people weren't worth saving, and I'd finally learned the lesson she'd been teaching. She just hadn't expected to be on the receiving end of that education. I'd been the second child and least important investment in my mother's portfolio for as long as I could remember. My sister Olivia was born first, arriving when my parents were young and still building their life together. She became the sun around which our family orbited, the golden child whose needs and wants shaped every family decision and financial choice. I came along 3 years later, unplanned according to family stories that were told like jokes at holiday gatherings, the surprise that disrupted my mother's return to work and forced another round of diapers and sleepless nights. My mother never said directly that she resented my existence, but the evidence was written in every choice she made about where to allocate resources. Olivia's problems were emergencies requiring immediate financial intervention. My problems were character-building opportunities to learn self-reliance and financial responsibility. The pattern established itself early and never wavered. When Olivia wanted dance lessons at age 7, my mother enrolled her in the most expensive studio in town, buying custom costumes and driving her to competitions 3 states away. When I asked to join Little League that same year, my mother said team sports were too expensive and suggested I play basketball at the public park instead. When Olivia struggled with math in middle school, my mother hired a private tutor at $80 per session, 3 times weekly for 2 years. When I struggled with reading comprehension, my mother told me to spend more time at the library and work harder. The financial disparity became impossible to ignore as we grew older, and the dollar amounts increased. When Olivia turned 16, my mother bought her a used Toyota Camry, paying $8,500 in cash and covering insurance costs for the first year. When I turned 16, my mother informed me that I could buy my own car if I wanted one, suggesting I get a job and start saving. I worked 30 hours per week through my junior and senior years of high school, stacking shifts at a grocery store and saving every possible dollar, eventually buying a beat-up Ford Taurus for $100 and $200 that broke down every few months. Each repair came from my own pocket while my mother covered every maintenance cost for Olivia's car without question. When Olivia applied to college, my mother paid for SAT prep courses, application fees, campus visits to 6 different schools, and eventually covered the first year's tuition at a private university that cost $35,000 annually. When I applied to college, my mother told me to apply for scholarships and consider community college for the first 2 years to save money. I did exactly that, working full-time while attending classes, graduating with $23,000 in student loan debt that I'd been paying off in careful installments for 7 years. The pattern continued after college, with increasingly expensive crises that my mother funded without hesitation for Olivia, while I handled my own problems alone. Olivia's first post-college crisis was getting fired from her marketing job after 6 months for chronic lateness and poor performance. My mother covered her rent for 3 months at $1,800 monthly, a total of $5,400, while Olivia figured things out and applied for new positions. When I lost my first job during a company downsizing, my mother's advice was to file for unemployment and cut my expenses. I moved into a studio apartment in a rough neighborhood, ate rice and beans for months, and found new work within 5 weeks because I couldn't afford to not work. Olivia's next crisis came when she decided to start a photography business, convincing my mother that this was her true calling and she needed professional equipment to succeed. My mother spent $12,000 on cameras, lenses, lighting equipment, and a website design. The business lasted 8 months before Olivia lost interest and moved on to other ideas, the expensive equipment gathering dust in her closet. When I mentioned wanting to get my CPA certification to advance my career, my mother suggested I save up for the exam fees and study materials myself. The financial favoritism became so systematic that I started keeping records, not to build a case against my mother, but to validate my own reality and push back against the gaslighting that happened whenever I mentioned the disparity. I opened a spreadsheet and began documenting every instance of financial assistance my mother gave Olivia versus what she gave me, tracking dates, amounts, and purposes. Within 2 years, I had documentation showing my mother had given Olivia approximately $73,000 in direct financial support for everything from rent payments to credit card debt to funding her 3rd failed business venture, an online boutique selling handmade jewelry that lost $8,000 before closing. During that same 2-year period, my mother had given me exactly $250, a birthday check that she'd presented with a lecture about financial responsibility and not expecting handouts. The spreadsheet grew to include psychological notes as well, instances where I'd asked for help and been denied while Olivia received assistance for far less urgent needs. The documentation became a form of self-care, proof that I wasn't imagining the pattern or being oversensitive about normal family dynamics. The breaking point that crystallized everything happened about 18 months ago when I had a medical emergency that my insurance only partially covered. I'd been experiencing severe abdominal pain for weeks, initially dismissing it as stress from work, but the pain escalated until I couldn't stand upright. My girlfriend at the time, Rachel, drove me to the emergency room at midnight on a Saturday. After 8 hours of testing, the doctors diagnosed me with acute appendicitis requiring immediate surgery. The appendectomy was successful, but the hospital bill was catastrophic for someone living paycheck to paycheck while paying down student loans. Even with insurance, my out-of-pocket costs totaled $6,800 for the surgery, hospital stay, and follow-up care. The hospital offered a payment plan, but the monthly installments would devastate my already tight budget. I called my mother from my apartment 3 days after being discharged, still recovering and barely able to walk without pain shooting through my abdomen. I explained the situation carefully, emphasizing this wasn't optional spending or poor planning but legitimate medical debt from an emergency surgery. I asked if she could loan me $3,000 to reduce the payment plan burden, promising to pay her back within a year with interest if she wanted. The silence on her end stretched for a long time before she responded with careful neutrality. My mother said she understood medical bills were stressful, but she couldn't help with that amount right now because money was tight. She suggested I look into medical debt forgiveness programs or negotiate a lower settlement with the hospital. She mentioned that lots of people dealt with medical debt, and I'd figure it out like everyone else did. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes before she said she had to go and wished me a smooth recovery. I hung up feeling gutted in a way that had nothing to do with my surgical incisions. The rejection itself wasn't surprising given our history, but the timing and circumstances made the favoritism impossible to rationalize away anymore. This wasn't a luxury purchase or optional expense. This was emergency surgery that had potentially saved my life, and my mother couldn't spare $3,000 to help reduce the burden. I sat on my couch that afternoon, prescription painkillers making everything slightly fuzzy, and thought about the pattern of assistance my mother had provided over the years. The $73,000 in documented support for Olivia, the countless smaller amounts I knew about but hadn't tracked. And for me, a medical emergency that might have been life-threatening if I'd delayed treatment longer, the answer was no, and a suggestion to negotiate with the hospital. The contrast became even sharper 2 weeks later when I learned through family conversation that my mother had just given Olivia $4,500 to cover credit card debt from a shopping trip to New York that had gotten out of control. Olivia had apparently charged expensive clothes, restaurant meals, and Broadway show tickets, spending far beyond her means. And when the bill arrived, she'd panicked and called my mother, crying. My mother had transferred the money within 24 hours, telling Olivia not to worry about paying it back and just to be more careful with credit cards in the future. I learned this during a family dinner that I'd attended despite still recovering from surgery, my abdomen tender and my pain medication schedule, making me slightly disconnected from the conversation. Olivia mentioned her recent trip to New York and thanked my mother for helping out with that credit situation, and my mother waved it off like it was nothing, saying that's what mothers do. I sat at that table, surgical staples still holding my abdomen together, and felt something fundamental break inside me. My mother had declined to help with my $3,000 emergency medical debt, but had given Olivia $4,500 for credit card bills from a luxury vacation she couldn't afford. The mathematical and moral calculation was so stark that I couldn't rationalize it into anything other than what it clearly was: systematic favoritism, that valued Olivia's comfort over my survival. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Raymond Foster, a clinical psychologist who specialized in family systems and adult children of dysfunctional families, about 3 months after my surgery. I initially sought therapy to process work stress and relationship issues, but within 2 sessions, Dr. Foster identified the core issue wasn't my career or my dating life. It was the accumulated trauma of growing up as the unfavored child in a family that had clear hierarchies of worth and investment. Dr. Foster asked me during our 3rd session to describe the last time my mother had provided significant financial or emotional support for something important to me. I sat in his office, afternoon light streaming through the windows, and genuinely couldn't think of a single example that wasn't obligatory parenting during my childhood. Every significant milestone, challenge, or crisis in my adult life had been handled alone or with support from friends and partners, never from my mother. Dr. Foster asked if I'd ever directly confronted my mother about the favoritism. I explained I'd tried a few times over the years, but she'd always responded with defensive deflection, claiming she treated both her children fairly and I was keeping score unfairly or being jealous of my sister. She'd point to the basics she'd provided during my childhood, conveniently ignoring that those basics were legal obligations, while the support she gave Olivia was voluntary and excessive. Dr. Foster suggested I start documenting not just the financial disparity, but the emotional patterns, The ways my mother's attention and concern flowed primarily toward Olivia, while I existed in the periphery. He explained that children of emotionally neglectful parents often gaslight themselves into minimizing the neglect, telling themselves it wasn't that bad or that they're being oversensitive. The documentation would serve as objective validation that my perceptions were based in consistent behavioral patterns rather than imagination or bitterness. I showed him the financial spreadsheet I'd already been keeping, and he commended the clarity but suggested adding qualitative entries about the emotional dynamics. I started keeping detailed notes on my phone, brief entries marking instances where the preferential treatment was impossible to deny. Within 3 months, I had 58 documented incidents. By 6 months, I stopped counting because the pattern was so repetitive that continuing felt masochistic. The entries read like a catalog of casual dismissal and strategic indifference from someone who was supposed to love me unconditionally. The documented pattern was relentless once I started paying attention. April 3rd, my mother spent 30 minutes on the phone with me, discussing my new job promotion, before pivoting to an hour-long conversation about Olivia's latest business idea, asking my professional opinion about the market viability, while never circling back to celebrate or ask questions about my achievement. May 19th, my mother canceled plans to help me move into a new apartment because Olivia needed her to babysit her friend's dog for the weekend, something Olivia had apparently committed to without checking if she'd actually be available. June 8th, I mentioned to my mother that I was struggling with anxiety and insomnia related to work pressure, and she suggested I try meditation apps and cutting back on caffeine before immediately changing the subject to Olivia's upcoming vacation plans. July 23rd, my mother gave Olivia $2,800 to cover her portion of a beach house rental with friends after Olivia had committed to the trip without having the money saved. August 15th, I asked my mother if she could loan me $800 to cover an unexpected car repair that would otherwise go on my credit card, and she said money was tight right now and suggested I look into payment plans with the mechanic. The pattern was so consistent, it became predictable, and that predictability made it somehow more painful because it confirmed this wasn't random or situational. This was who my mother was in relation to me. The crisis that forced everything into impossible clarity happened on a Monday evening in October, about 6 months after I'd started therapy with Dr. Foster. I'd been working late on a particularly complex audit, getting home around 9 p.m. exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. My phone rang as I was making dinner, my mother's name appearing on the screen. I almost didn't answer, our recent interactions having been brief and surface level, but something made me pick up. Her voice was tense, worried, explaining that Olivia was in trouble and needed help immediately. My sister had apparently gotten a DUI 3 days earlier, her second one in 4 years, and this time she was facing serious legal consequences, including potential jail time. The lawyer Olivia had consulted said she needed to hire an experienced DUI attorney who specialized in repeat offenders, someone who could negotiate with the prosecutor and potentially get the charges reduced or arrange alternative sentencing. The attorney's retainer was $15,000, due within a week to secure representation before Olivia's arraignment. My mother explained all this with the assumption that I'd understand the urgency and seriousness, that I'd naturally want to help my sister avoid jail time and a permanent criminal record. Then came the ask that somehow shocked me despite being entirely predictable. My mother said she'd already committed to paying $10,000 toward the attorney, pulling money from her retirement savings, but she was $5,000 short. She asked if I could contribute the remaining amount, framing it as a family emergency where we all needed to come together to protect Olivia from the consequences of her mistakes. I stood in my kitchen, frozen food burning in the microwave I'd forgotten to stop, and felt my blood pressure spike. My mother, who'd refused me $3,000 for emergency surgery 6 months ago, was asking me to contribute $5,000 to hire a lawyer for my sister's second DUI. The mathematical and moral absurdity was so extreme, I almost laughed. I asked my mother if she remembered that I'd needed help with medical bills recently, and she'd said money was too tight. There was a pause, and then she said that was different because I'd been able to work out a payment plan, but Olivia couldn't work out a payment plan with jail time. She said this was more urgent, more serious, with consequences that would follow Olivia forever if we didn't help her now. I asked how my emergency surgery was less urgent than legal fees for a crime my sister had committed by choosing to drive drunk. My mother's tone shifted to frustrated, saying I was being difficult and refusing to help my sister when she needed me most. I told my mother I wouldn't be contributing anything toward Olivia's legal fees. The silence that followed was heavy with shock and anger, my mother clearly not having anticipated refusal. She asked if I was really going to let my sister go to jail because I was holding a grudge about old situations. I said I wasn't holding a grudge. I was simply following the financial boundaries she'd established through 30 years of consistent behavior. She'd taught me that everyone handles their own problems, that asking family for money was inappropriate, that independence and self-reliance were paramount values. I was just applying those lessons universally, rather than selectively. My mother said this was completely different, that Olivia's situation was an emergency requiring family support, and she was disappointed I couldn't see past my own resentment to help when it mattered. I said Olivia's situation was a consequence of her own choices, and that using family money to shield her from those consequences would prevent her from learning accountability. My mother's voice went cold, telling me she'd never realized how selfish and cruel I could be, that she'd raised me better than this, that she was ashamed of my refusal to help family in crisis. I hung up without responding further and stood in my kitchen while the microwave beeped insistently, feeling strangely calm despite the confrontation. Dr. Foster and I discussed the situation in our next session, and he asked how I felt about refusing to help. I admitted I'd expected to feel guilty or conflicted, but instead, I felt relieved and validated. For the first time in my life, I'd enforced a boundary with my mother and held firm despite her emotional manipulation. Dr. Foster pointed out that my mother had revealed her true framework through this crisis. She believed family support was obligatory when it benefited Olivia, but optional when I needed it. He asked if I thought my mother genuinely didn't see the double standard, or if she saw it but didn't care. I said I thought she saw it, but had rationalized it so thoroughly over the years that she'd convinced herself her treatment of us was fair. She'd built a narrative where Olivia needed more support because life was harder for her, conveniently ignoring that life was harder for Olivia because my mother enabled her irresponsible choices. Meanwhile, I'd developed resilience and self-sufficiency because I'd had no choice, and my mother took credit for teaching me independence rather than acknowledging she'd simply neglected my needs. Dr. Foster said my analysis was probably accurate and asked what I wanted to do with this new clarity about family dynamics. I decided to distance myself from my mother and sister systematically, creating space between us that would protect me from ongoing emotional damage and financial exploitation. I stopped calling except to return urgent messages, kept conversations brief and surface level when they did occur, and declined most family gatherings with vague excuses about work obligations. The strategic disengagement wasn't about punishment, though I knew my mother would interpret it that way. It was about self-preservation, removing myself from a system that had consistently devalued me while demanding I remain available for support when it benefited others. My mother noticed the shift within weeks, calling to ask if everything was okay and why I'd been so distant. I gave non-committal responses about being busy with work and promised to reach out when things settled down, knowing things would never settle down because I'd decided to maintain this distance permanently. She called a few more times with increasing frustration, eventually sending a long text message saying she felt shut out of my life and didn't understand what had happened to make me withdraw from family. I didn't respond to the text, letting my silence speak for itself. Olivia called me directly about 2 months after the DUI situation, asking why I'd been avoiding family events and ignoring my mother's calls. She said my mother was really hurt and confused, that my behavior was creating unnecessary drama during an already stressful time. I asked Olivia if she'd repaid the $10,000 my mother had pulled from retirement savings for her legal fees. She said she was working on it, but money was tight, maybe in a few months when she got her tax refund. I asked if she'd thanked my mother adequately for that financial sacrifice. She said of course she had. My mother knew how grateful she was. I asked if she remembered that I'd needed help with medical bills earlier that year and been told money was too tight. Olivia sounded confused, saying she vaguely remembered something about that but didn't know the details. I explained the details, the surgery, the $6,800 bill, the request for help, the denial, and then the immediate assistance for her credit card debt 2 weeks later. Olivia was quiet, then said defensively that those situations weren't really comparable because medical bills could be paid over time, but her credit card interest was killing her. I said emergency surgery wasn't comparable to luxury vacation debt, that the disparity in how our mother treated our financial crises was systematic and undeniable. Olivia said I was being dramatic and keeping score, that families help each other, and I was the one creating division by refusing to help when she'd needed it. I told Olivia I was done pretending our mother treated us equally, done ignoring the obvious favoritism that had shaped our entire lives, done being available for family obligations while receiving nothing in return. Olivia said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that my mother had raised me, and I owed her basic respect and support. I said respect was earned through reciprocal care, not demanded based on biological relationship, and my mother had forfeited my willingness to help by spending 30 years demonstrating I wasn't worth investing in. Olivia hung up on me, and I added her to the list of family members I'd strategically disengaged from. The isolation felt cleaner than the previous pattern of hoping for change that never came. Over the following months, I built a life where my mother's and sister's absence didn't leave a gap. I invested more in friendships, particularly with my colleague and close friend Terrence, who'd been invaluable in helping me process family dynamics with honest feedback that didn't pull punches. Terrence worked in the same audit department, a senior analyst who'd been at the firm for 12 years and had become something of a mentor. He'd noticed my family dynamics during a company holiday party where my mother had attended as my guest, but spent the entire evening talking about Olivia's latest business venture, barely acknowledging my work achievements that the party was partially celebrating. Terrence had pulled me aside afterward and asked point blank if my family always treated me like background noise. The directness had been startling but refreshing. Terrence's perspective on my mother's behavior was simpler and harsher than Dr. Foster's therapeutic framework. He said my mother was a narcissist who designated Olivia as the golden child and me as the scapegoat, classic family dysfunction patterns that probably wouldn't change because they served my mother's emotional needs. He said I could spend decades trying to earn her approval and investment, or I could accept that I'd never be prioritized and build a life that didn't require her validation. The blunt assessment resonated with me more than therapeutic concepts about attachment and family systems. I started thinking of my mother's favoritism as a fixed personality trait rather than a problem I could solve through better communication or changed behavior on my part. The mental shift helped. I stopped feeling hurt when she chose Olivia over me because I'd stopped expecting anything different. When my mother skipped my birthday dinner to help Olivia move into yet another apartment, I felt mildly annoyed at the inconvenience of adjusting the reservation, but not devastated by her absence. When she forgot to call on my birthday the following year, I noticed but didn't particularly care. The emotional detachment I'd cultivated was working, protecting me by eliminating investment in whether my mother showed up for me. The major escalation happened about 3 months ago when I discovered the full extent of my mother's financial support for Olivia through a conversation with my Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister who'd always been more observant of family dynamics than most relatives. Aunt Linda called me out of concern after learning I'd been distant from family, wanting to understand what had caused the rift. I explained the pattern of favoritism and financial disparity, giving specific examples with dollar amounts. Aunt Linda was quiet for a long time before admitting she'd noticed the different treatment over the years, but hadn't realized. The financial amounts were so substantial. Then she shared information that made everything worse. She said my mother had taken out a second mortgage on her house 18 months ago, borrowing $55,000 in equity, ostensibly for home renovations. The renovations never happened. Instead, my mother had used that money to fund Olivia's latest business venture, an online coaching program for women entrepreneurs that had failed within 6 months and lost the entire investment. Aunt Linda had learned this through a conversation with my mother where she'd mentioned struggling with the mortgage payments and regretting the decision to borrow so much. The revelation was staggering, not just because of the amount, but because of what it represented. My mother had leveraged her home, her primary asset and retirement security, to fund another one of Olivia's doomed business ideas. She'd borrowed $55,000 to give to my sister, while refusing me $3,000 for emergency surgery. The mathematical and moral equation was so lopsided I couldn't process it initially. I asked Aunt Linda if she was certain about these details, if maybe she'd misunderstood the situation. She said she was certain. My mother had been explicit about using the borrowed money for Olivia's business, and was now worried about making the monthly payments on her reduced income since she'd partially retired last year. I asked if Olivia knew about the second mortgage and the sacrifice my mother had made. Aunt Linda said she didn't know, but she doubted my mother had told Olivia the full story because she never wanted Olivia to feel guilty about the financial support she received. The conversation ended with Aunt Linda encouraging me to reconcile with my mother before the distance became permanent, saying life was short and family was important despite imperfections. I thanked her for the information and said I'd think about what she'd shared. I didn't think about reconciliation at all. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settle over me that this was who my mother was fundamentally, someone who would sacrifice her own financial security to fund Olivia's failures while denying me basic support. The pattern wasn't going to change because my mother had chosen where to invest her resources, and I'd never been the worthy investment. Dr. Foster and I discussed the second mortgage revelation in our next session, and he asked how I felt about this new information. I said I felt validated, that every time I'd questioned whether I was being too harsh or unforgiving about my mother's favoritism, new evidence emerged, proving the pattern was even more extreme than I'd recognized. Dr. Foster pointed out that my mother was now facing financial consequences from her choices, that the second mortgage payments were apparently straining her budget. He asked if I felt any responsibility to help her with the situation she'd created. I said I felt no responsibility whatsoever, that she'd made choices that demonstrated where her priorities lay, and living with the consequences of those choices was appropriate. If she'd invested even a fraction of the money she'd given Olivia into building a relationship with me, into showing she valued me as much as my sister, I might feel differently. But she hadn't, and I didn't. The crisis text arrived 6 weeks after my conversation with Aunt Linda, the message about needing $15,000 by the next morning to prevent foreclosure. I learned later through family channels that my mother had missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments, the combination of her reduced income from partial retirement and the burden of the second mortgage payment creating impossible math. The bank had filed foreclosure proceedings after failed attempts to work out a payment plan, and my mother had exhausted her savings trying to catch up. She was exactly $15,000 short of what she needed to bring the account current and stop the foreclosure. She'd called Olivia first, who apparently didn't have access to that kind of money, and suggested she ask me. My mother had been reluctant to ask me given our strained relationship and my previous refusal to help with Olivia's legal fees, but desperation had overridden pride. The text was her Hail Mary, a last attempt to avoid losing the house she'd lived in for 30 years. My forward response, I can't help you, was true in the sense that I wasn't willing to help, though technically I had the money available. I'd been saving aggressively for years, living below my means and investing carefully, building the kind of financial security my mother had taught me to value by refusing to provide it herself. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My mother called repeatedly the next morning, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails as the deadline approached. She called Aunt Linda, who called me asking if I'd help my mother keep her home. I explained the history of financial favoritism, the second mortgage taken for Olivia's business, the decades of prioritizing my sister's wants over my needs. Aunt Linda said she understood my hurt, but this was about preventing my mother from becoming homeless, not about settling old scores. I said my mother had choices. She could ask Olivia to sell some of her possessions to raise money, could downsize to a cheaper home, could file for bankruptcy if necessary. These were the same types of solutions my mother had suggested to me during various crises. Aunt Linda said I was being cruel and vindictive, punishing my mother in a moment of genuine emergency. I said I was being consistent with the values my mother had taught me about financial independence and living within one's means. The call ended tensely, and I turned my phone to do not disturb mode to avoid the flood of calls and messages I knew would come from other family members. The foreclosure proceeded, my mother losing the house in a quick sale that covered the mortgages but left her with no equity and no place to live. She moved in with Olivia temporarily, the two of them sharing Olivia's two-bedroom apartment in the arrangement that was clearly tense based on what I heard through family gossip. My extended family split into factions, some supporting my decision and others viewing me as heartless for refusing to help my mother in genuine crisis. My Uncle David, my father's brother who'd stayed close with my mother after my parents' divorce when I was young, called me directly to express his disappointment. He said he'd always thought of me as the good kid, the responsible son, and my refusal to help my mother was completely out of character. I asked Uncle David if he knew about the second mortgage and what it had funded. He said he'd heard something about that but didn't know specifics. I gave him the specifics: the $55,000 borrowed for Olivia's failed business, the previous $73,000 in documented support for Olivia over 2 years, the pattern of refusing me basic help while funding my sister's lifestyle. Uncle David was quiet, then said the past shouldn't determine how I responded in the present crisis. I said the past was the only reliable predictor of the future, and my mother had spent 30 years predicting she wouldn't prioritize me. I was simply believing her pattern and responding accordingly. The emotional reckoning happened through a series of texts between my mother and me about 2 weeks after she'd lost the house. She sent a long message late one evening, apparently composed after several glasses of wine based on the increasingly rambling tone. She said she couldn't believe I'd let her lose her home, that she'd never imagined her son could be so cold and unfeeling, that she'd sacrificed so much to raise me, and this was how I repaid her. She said she knew we'd had our differences, but thought family meant showing up during true emergencies, that she was heartbroken by my refusal to help when she'd needed me most. The message ended with a guilt-laden question about whether I felt good about myself knowing my mother was living in her other daughter's spare room because I couldn't spare the money to help. I read the message 3 times, feeling my anger build with each reading. The lack of self-awareness, the complete inability to see any connection between her decades of favoritism and my current refusal to help, the victimhood mentality that positioned her as the injured party, all of it confirmed that nothing had changed in her fundamental worldview. I typed a response that I'd been mentally composing for months, maybe years. I told my mother that her financial crisis was the natural consequence of choices she'd made, specifically the choice to take out a second mortgage to fund another one of Olivia's failing business ventures. I said I'd asked her for $3,000 to help with emergency medical bills and been told money was too tight, but she'd borrowed $55,000 to give to my sister for a business that anyone with basic financial literacy could have, predicted, would fail. I said she'd spent my entire life demonstrating through action, not words, that Olivia's comfort mattered more than my survival, that Olivia's wants were prioritized over my needs, that I was the child she invested in minimally, while Olivia received every resource available. I said I'd documented over $130,000 in financial support she'd given Olivia in the past 5 years alone, while giving me less than $500 total during that same period. I told her the reason I didn't help with the foreclosure was because she'd taught me through 30 years of consistent behavior that people need to handle their own problems, and I was finally applying that lesson universally instead of just to myself. The message was long, detailed, and without mercy. I sent it and turned off my phone, not wanting to see her response immediately. My mother's response came the next morning, shorter and angrier than her previous message. She said I was twisting everything, that she'd always loved both her children equally, that any extra support Olivia received was because she needed more help, not because of favoritism. She said I'd always been more capable and independent, so I'd needed less support, framing the disparity as appropriate response to different capabilities rather than preference. She said taking out the second mortgage had been a mistake in hindsight, but she'd believed in Olivia's business idea and wanted to give her daughter a chance to succeed. She said she couldn't believe I'd turned my back on her during the lowest point of her life, that she'd failed as a mother if I'd grown into someone who could watch his mother lose everything without lifting a finger to help. The response was pure deflection and defensiveness. No acknowledgement of the pattern I'd detailed, no recognition that her choices had consequences, no curiosity about how her behavior had affected me. I didn't respond, letting my silence communicate what words apparently couldn't penetrate. The conversation ended there, and we didn't speak again for weeks. The public exposure came through a source I hadn't anticipated: social media. Olivia apparently posted a long Facebook message about our family situation, painting me as the villain who'd refused to help our mother keep her home, despite having the financial means to do so. The post was carefully crafted to generate maximum sympathy, describing our mother as a devoted parent who'd worked hard her entire life, who'd sacrificed to raise 2 children alone after divorce, who'd always been there for her kids, and now needed help herself. The post portrayed me as successful and financially stable, someone who could easily afford to help but chose not to out of petty resentment and family grudges. The post didn't mention the second mortgage or the pattern of financial favoritism, just positioned the situation as an ungrateful son abandoning his struggling mother. The post got significant traction, over 200 comments, from Olivia's friends and acquaintances expressing shock and disappointment about my behavior, many tagging me in comments urging me to help my mother. The public nature of the accusation forced me to make a choice: stay silent and let the narrative stand, or respond with the full truth and documentation that would destroy my mother's and sister's public images. I chose truth, but I chose it strategically. I didn't respond on Facebook where emotion would overwhelm facts. Instead, I created a detailed document outlining the financial history between my mother and me, including the spreadsheet I'd maintained for years showing over $130,000 in documented support for Olivia versus less than $1,000 for me over 5 years. I included specific examples with dates and amounts: the medical bill denial, the credit card debt payment for Olivia 2 weeks later, the DUI attorney fees, the second mortgage for Olivia's business. I included screenshots of texts where I'd asked for help and been denied, followed by evidence of my mother immediately helping Olivia with larger amounts for less urgent needs. The document was 18 pages of systematic documentation proving the favoritism wasn't imagined or exaggerated, but measurable and consistent. I shared it with select family members, not to create drama, but to establish the factual record for people who might wonder if Olivia's post was accurate. The document spread through family channels quickly, people forwarding it to others, and within a week, the narrative had shifted dramatically. Family members who'd initially judged me for refusing to help started reaching out to apologize or express shock at the documented disparity. Aunt Linda called me after seeing the document, her voice shaken as she said she'd known about some favoritism, but hadn't realized the extent of the financial disparity or the systematic nature of it. She apologized for pressuring me to help with the foreclosure without understanding the full history. She said the document made clear that my refusal wasn't about one crisis, but about 30 years of accumulated neglect and exploitation. Several cousins reached out with similar sentiments, saying they'd always thought of our family as normal if imperfect, but the documentation revealed dysfunction they hadn't perceived from the outside. My Uncle David called to apologize for his earlier judgment, saying he'd talked to my mother after seeing the document, and she'd confirmed the basic facts while trying to justify them as appropriate responses to different children having different needs. He said he'd told my mother that justification didn't hold up against the stark numbers, that she'd chosen to invest in one child, while essentially abandoning the other financially and emotionally. The public opinion within our extended family shifted decisively in my favor, not because I'd argued my case emotionally, but because I'd provided undeniable documentation that made my mother's behavior impossible to rationalize. The professional consequences for my mother came through unexpected channels. My mother worked part-time as a financial advisor at a small wealth management firm, a job she'd held for 8 years advising clients on retirement planning and investment strategies. Someone from our extended family, I never learned who, sent the documentation to her employer with a note questioning whether someone who'd mismanaged her own finances so catastrophically should be advising others on financial planning. The firm's compliance department launched an internal review, concerned about reputational risk and whether my mother's judgment could be trusted. The review found that my mother had given clients conservative advice about debt management and living within means while personally taking out a second mortgage to fund a speculative business venture. The hypocrisy between her professional advice and personal choices created liability concerns. The firm offered my mother the option to resign rather than be terminated, and she took it, losing income she needed to rebuild after the foreclosure. The job loss was collateral damage I hadn't intended, but didn't particularly regret, natural consequences of behavior that should have had consequences long ago. Olivia's response to the document and the shifting family opinion was predictably defensive and aggressive. She called me for the first time in months, her voice tight with anger as she accused me of destroying our mother's reputation and livelihood out of spite. She said I'd taken private family matters and weaponized them to humiliate my mother publicly, that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I said she'd opened this door by posting lies on social media, and I'd simply corrected the record with facts. She said the Facebook post wasn't lies, our mother really had lost her house, and I really had refused to help. I said the post lied by omission, failing to mention the decades of context that explained my refusal. Olivia said I was vindictive and cruel, that our mother was suffering real consequences for mistakes she'd acknowledged. I asked when exactly our mother had acknowledged her mistakes, because I'd received no apology or admission of wrongdoing. Olivia said our mother had apologized to her for getting the family into this situation. I said apologizing to Olivia for consequences that affected her wasn't the same as apologizing to me for 30 years of favoritism. Olivia said I needed to let go of the past and focus on helping our mother recover from current circumstances. I said the past was only past for people who'd benefited from it. For me, it was an ongoing pattern that continued through every interaction. The conversation deteriorated from there, Olivia accusing me of being heartless and me pointing out the hypocrisy of that accusation coming from someone who'd accepted over $130,000 in unearned financial support while watching me struggle with medical debt. She said she'd never asked our mother for most of that money, that our mother had offered because she wanted to help. I said that made it worse, not better, because it meant our mother had chosen to help her without being asked while refusing me when I did ask. Olivia said I was being impossible, and she was done trying to make me see reason. I said I was being consistent, and I was done accepting differential treatment as normal. She hung up, and we haven't spoken since. The family fracture was complete, lines drawn clearly with most people understanding my position, even if they wished I'd handled it differently. My mother remained in Olivia's apartment, the two of them financially interdependent in a way that created obvious tension. Olivia couldn't afford her apartment without roommate support, and my mother couldn't afford her own place after the foreclosure. They were stuck together, and from what I heard through family channels, the arrangement was miserable for both of them. Dr. Foster and I processed the aftermath over several sessions, and he asked whether I felt I'd achieved the justice or vindication I'd been seeking. I said I hadn't been seeking justice consciously, just protection from ongoing harm, but the exposure had provided unexpected validation. For 30 years, I'd been told my perceptions of favoritism were wrong, that I was being oversensitive or keeping score unfairly. The documentation had proven objectively that my perceptions were accurate and, if anything, understated. The validation mattered more than I'd expected, not because it changed my mother's behavior, but because it confirmed my reality was real and my reactions were reasonable. Dr. Foster asked if I felt guilty about the consequences my mother faced, losing her house, losing her job, living in constrained circumstances. I said I felt nothing about those consequences because they flowed naturally from choices she'd made. If she'd managed her finances responsibly, invested equally in both children, maintained professional standards in her personal life, none of these consequences would have occurred. She'd created this situation through systematic poor judgment, and I wasn't responsible for protecting her from outcomes she'd engineered. Dr. Foster said my lack of guilt was actually healthy. That guilt would suggest I still accepted responsibility for my mother's well-being, despite her never accepting reciprocal responsibility for mine. The final communication from my mother came about 3 weeks ago, a handwritten letter delivered to my apartment by Aunt Linda, who'd been designated as intermediary. The letter was 6 pages long, my mother's handwriting shaky in places, suggesting the emotional difficulty of writing it. She said she'd spent months thinking about our family dynamics and the documentation I'd shared, consulting with a therapist Aunt Linda had recommended, trying to understand how things had gotten so broken. She acknowledged, for the first time, that she'd treated Olivia and me differently, that the financial disparity was undeniable when laid out in numbers. She said she'd rationalized her choices at the time by telling herself Olivia needed more support because life was harder for her, not recognizing that life was harder for Olivia partially because she'd enabled her irresponsibility. She said she'd taken me for granted, assumed I didn't need help because I always figured things out, not recognizing that I figured things out alone because she'd forced me to. She said she understood why I'd refused to help with the foreclosure, that from my perspective she'd demonstrated I wasn't worth investing in and had no right to expect investment in return. The acknowledgement was more thorough than I'd expected, addressing specifics from my documentation rather than offering vague apologies. The letter continued with something closer to genuine contrition. My mother said she couldn't undo 30 years of choices, couldn't repay the money she'd given Olivia or the support she'd denied me. She said she'd lost her house, her job, and her relationship with her son, and she deserved all of it based on how she'd treated me. She said she didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation, but wanted me to know she finally understood what she'd done and why it was wrong. She said if she could change how she'd parented us, she would, but since she couldn't change the past, she was trying to change her present behavior. She'd stopped giving Olivia money unconditionally, requiring her to budget and pay her own bills. She'd started seeing a therapist to understand why she'd played favorites so systematically. She'd gotten a new job, less prestigious and lower paying, but honest work that let her contribute to expenses. She said she was trying to become someone who deserved a relationship with me, even though she knew that might never happen. The letter ended with a simple statement. She was sorry. She loved me. And she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. I read the letter 3 times, sitting on my couch while afternoon light faded outside my windows, trying to determine if the apology was genuine or another manipulation attempt. The specificity suggested genuine reflection, the acknowledgement of concrete facts from my documentation rather than vague admissions of imperfection. The lack of requests or expectations, no asking me to forgive her or help her or maintain contact, suggested this wasn't a strategy to regain access to me. The letter felt like closure, my mother finally acknowledging what I'd known my entire life and what she'd denied until circumstances forced her to face it. I showed the letter to Dr. Foster in our next session, and he read it carefully before asking what I wanted to do with this information. I said I didn't know. That acknowledgement without action felt insufficient. But acknowledgement was also more than I'd received in 3 decades of trying to make her see the pattern. Dr. Foster asked if I believed my mother could change at this point. I said I believed she could change her behavior going forward, but I didn't believe she could retroactively become the mother I'd needed during the years when her support would have mattered. The damage was done, my childhood and young adulthood shaped by her choices, and no amount of current growth would erase that history. Terrence asked me a simpler question over drinks after work one evening. Did I want a relationship with my mother, regardless of whether she deserved one? The question cut through all the therapeutic processing and moral calculations to something more fundamental. Did I actually want her in my life? Or was I just processing the guilt and obligation that came from being raised to believe family relationships were mandatory? I sat with the question for a long time, watching condensation form on my beer glass, trying to access my actual desires beneath the layers of hurt and anger. The honest answer was that I didn't want a relationship with my mother, not because she didn't deserve one after her apology, but because the relationship had only ever caused me pain. Even if she changed completely, even if she started treating me with the priority and investment she'd given Olivia, it wouldn't restore the years of feeling invisible and unimportant. It wouldn't give me back the childhood where my mother showed up for my events and celebrated my achievements. Some damage couldn't be repaired, only accepted and moved past. I told Terrence I didn't want to rebuild the relationship, and saying it out loud felt like releasing a weight I'd carried my entire life. I haven't responded to my mother's letter, and I don't plan to. The silence is my answer, a final boundary that says I've heard her acknowledgement, but don't require anything further from her. I've built a life that works without her in it, surrounded by people who show up consistently and reciprocally. My career is thriving. Recent promotion to senior manager came with recognition I'd earned through competence rather than family connection. My friendships are deep and mutually supportive, built on actual care rather than obligatory relation. I'm dating someone new, a woman named Claire who I met through work and who understands complicated family dynamics from her own experience. The absence of my mother and sister leaves a hole, but it's a clean hole rather than a festering wound, space where dysfunction used to live that's now open for healthier connections. I think about them occasionally, wondering how they're managing financially and emotionally, but the wondering is distant and academic rather than emotionally engaged. They're people I used to know, whose problems I understand but don't participate in solving. The relationship ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet withdrawal, and that ending feels appropriate for the slow accumulation of hurt that characterized our family dynamic. 6 months have passed since that text message asking for $15,000, and I haven't regretted my refusal once. Not when I heard my mother lost the house, not when I learned she'd lost her job, not when family members described her struggling to adjust to diminished circumstances. The lack of guilt or regret tells me I made the right choice, that the boundary I enforced was necessary and overdue. My mother taught me through 30 years of consistent behavior that some people aren't worth investing in, that financial and emotional resources should be allocated carefully to those who deserve them, that independence matters more than family loyalty. I learned those lessons well, probably better than she intended. The difference is, I applied them universally, judging her by the same standards she'd applied to me. She didn't like being evaluated by her own metrics, didn't enjoy being on the receiving end of the indifference and strategic calculation she'd directed at me for decades. But that discomfort was appropriate, natural consequences for someone who'd built a relationship on conditional support and preferential treatment. My mother lost everything because she'd chosen for 30 years to invest everything in someone other than me. When her emergency came, I did exactly what she'd taught me to do, prioritize myself and let her handle her own problems. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it. 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 Hit like. You've earned it.